kind of in the last quarter of this accelerator, gearing up for demo day. And I hope that it's been a wonderful experience for you all. I'm going to quickly introduce myself, and unfortunately, I don't have a moderator for me because obviously, apparently, I don't need one, and I'll self-moderate. But also because I'm sharing my screen, it means that I can't really see what's happening on the team side of things. So I'll check it every so often. So if you put up your hand and I don't call on you, just know it's because I'm sharing my screen currently and I can't really see what's happening on the team side of things. But I'll make sure that I keep looking at it and make sure that I'm able to respond as needed. We have a pretty not complex topic today, but I think is one of my favorite topics, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. But before I do that, maybe let me take a bit more time to introduce myself to you. As I said, I've met you all before. I was part of the interview team on the accelerator, and I hosted a wonderful session on data policies where we had a very robust conversation with the data regulator in Ghana. So my name is Tonya Kariuki. And I work with an organization called Holistic Technology Services, who you know are the implementation partners for InnoLab Ghana. To tell you a little bit more about myself, I studied law, so I like to say I'm a lawyer by training, but not by anything else. I had the opportunity to, at the end of your law degree, what they do in Kenya for you to be admitted to the bar, you have to go to what they call the School of Law. So School of Law back then used to be split into two pieces. The first half of that was a pupillage, which was an attachment or an internship of sorts where you're attached. I think it's pretty much the same in a lot of former British colonies. So I did my attachment at a wonderful law firm in Nairobi. But it was the best and worst experience of my life, because what happens when you're a pupil is you get to do all the jobs that nobody else wants to do. And I found myself stuck reconstructing files from the late 50s. And I just thought to myself, my image in my mind of what the law was supposed to be, which obviously was heavily influenced by films and movies from Hollywood, and what I was facing in practicality just didn't sound like the real deal. But as I was minding my business, I'd had the opportunity on the day I graduated, actually from university, to meet an individual who became a really good friend over the years. And he happened to be visiting Nairobi at that point in time, and called me. He used to be, strangely enough, the barman at the Sheraton. And he called me and he said to me, listen, I'm here to start up a company, and I wonder whether you'd like to come join me. And I say to him, okay, fine. So what's the company called? And without aging myself too much, I have to let you know that this was in, I think, 1997 or so, 1996, late 96. And I said to him, what's the company called? And he tells me the company is called Microsoft. And I'm like, I've never heard of this company in my life. And he says, it's a well-known company and they're doing really well. Have you never heard of Bill Gates? And I'm like, no, I don't know who that is. And in my defense, obviously, from a legal standpoint, especially back in those days, the most technology we had was a dictaphone. The most technology we had was a dictaphone, and that was the extent of my experience in the land of technology. Anyway, so I go home and I I I tell I tell my dad, can you hear me? Okay. I go home and I tell my dad I got a job offer from a company called Microsoft. And he says to me, I don't know who that is. All I know is that the law is a profession and I want you in a profession. And I don't know who this fly-by-night company is, but I don't recommend you go there. But my younger brother, who's around 16 at the time, happens to be listening in. And when my dad walks away, he says to me, have you heard of Bill Gates? I say, no. He says to me, he's the richest man in the world. And I just thought to myself, if this guy is the richest man in the world, I think I should join his company. And so that's where the law and I parted ways. I had the honor of being the first employee of Microsoft I think, in sub-Saharan Africa, if I'm not wrong. I know we had an office in Egypt, and around the same year, we launched an office in South Africa, and then we were launching the Nairobi office. And you know, it was really a wonderful journey. I ended up working for Microsoft for 20 years. And honestly, I left at 20 years, not because I didn't like the company anymore, but because I felt at that point in time that I was in great danger of having a very myopic view of the world, you know, the world according to Microsoft. And sometimes you find that that's very tunnel visioned, right? And so at about 18 years after having done various number of roles within the organization, so I joined to set up the local entity, and I suppose that's why my legal experience was supposed to be a great thing. And then I quickly moved on, and I moved into channel marketing. So really helped build out the sales channel for Microsoft across Africa. And we grew from something like, I don't know, 5 channel partners to 1,800 by the time I was leaving the company. So I did a lot of work in channel marketing. And I really think that that was the first time that I experienced, back in those days, they never called them startups. But in hindsight now, I think that that's the best way to describe them. So there were typically these organizations who were first somewhat engaged in terms of, you know, reselling Microsoft solutions in the market. And at that point in time, that was really, you know, you kind of had the big boys, the big tech, and then you had resellers and so on in the market. And there was very little of people building their own IP happening on the African continent. And actually, it's not just Africa. I think it was a global thing at that point in time. But I really think that my love for the startup ecosystem probably came from that first experience. And particularly when you're in corporate, the experience of working with entrepreneurs is a really humbling experience. You think you know everything until you realize you know nothing at all. So I spent quite a bit of time in channel marketing. I then moved on to product marketing, and I was responsible for our flagship products, which was Windows and Office. Did that for a while, and then moved up into being the head of marketing. But Microsoft was a strange place. So while I'm head of marketing, and it was lovely, I had a good region to take care of. They kind of approached me and said to me, listen, we've been trying to recruit for a role. We can't really find anybody for it, but we need you to kind of step into this role as a place filler, and hopefully help us find your replacement. And so I found myself, believe it or not, running the finance docket at the company. And fortunately for me, I had some expert finance people, but the finance function at Microsoft was also quite complicated, very much focused on scorecard, revenue metrics, and that sort of thing. And I think it was a great learning experience for me. It made me understand at that point in time what really matters in terms of financial KPIs, what you focus on, how do you differentiate the value between leading indicators, lagging indicators, and then really contextualized marketing for me in a very unique perspective, right? So sometimes when you're in some of these functions, you think that you've kind of hit all the high notes, you've got leads coming in, but it's not translating to revenue, and that's somebody else's problem. But when you sit in the finance seat and you start to look at some of these indicators, it starts to tell you or teach you maybe from a very early stage what analytics should look like, and then you start to understand where to drive interventions. So I spent about 3 years in finance, and I left and I couldn't wait to see the back of it, and I went back into marketing. Had a good time there. At that point in time, the company was starting to go through a lot of changes, and that was when we were starting to see things like the cloud coming through, and cloud-based applications. Gaming started coming in, and coming in the context of even on the African continent. So it was a really exciting time to be in marketing. And then the company came back to me and said, listen, we have another role and we don't yet have a person. So we need you to hold on to this role for us for a few years. And so I transitioned into HR. And so I was HR director for East and Southern Africa. And I have to tell you 2 things about the HR role. The first thing is, sometimes, and we're going to talk a little bit about this today, but we over-focus a little bit on what the function is versus what core competencies are required to be successful in a function. At the time that I moved over into the HR role, I really felt I didn't have the skill set to do anything to do with HR. And 3 months into the HR role, I started to notice certain similarities, believe it or not, between marketing and HR. First is, you know, when you look at marketing, your core role is to win hearts and minds of customers. That's where things like value propositions, customer value propositions come in, and so on and so forth. And when you look at it from an HR standpoint, your first role is to win the hearts and the minds of your employee. And core competency here is not the customer or the employee. The competency, knowledge and ability of how to win hearts and so very transferable. Very, very you have an employee position and or why? Okay. Okay. All right. Can you let me know if you can hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm back. I just switched my Wi-Fi connection. So just let me know if you lose me. So that was a great transition and really understanding that, sometimes if you take a step back, and I really encourage you, particularly when you're walking through the hiring journey, not to get overly caught up necessarily in people's previous roles, but to really start to look at a competency level, what is it that they do, and what is it that they're skilled at, and how can they bring that to this role? Anyway, so I spent, I think, 5 years in the HR role, and it was a mixed emotions for me, I have to be honest. Number one, it was mixed because I came from marketing, and I'm a lawyer, and I'm generally quite an extroverted character. And in the HR universe, or in the people leadership, when you're a people or a talent manager, um, it almost calls for you to put your own ego and personality aside and start to understand how do you lead people to by a series of great questions to the right answer rather than telling them what to do. And that come from marketing, where our job was to stand on stage with the spotlight on you and tell customers how they're going to feel about your product and tell people how you're the most wonderful in the world. And of course, at the same time, bash the competition as much as possible, right? So it was really a huge change for me to kind of be able to take a back seat. And the truth is, it's almost an unforgiving role sometimes, because when things go great, nobody ever says, oh my God, the HR team is doing such a phenomenal job. When things are bad, everyone says our HR isn't working. But when things are good, the glory goes to the people who really are somewhat an outcome of the work that you've put in, but very little credit comes back to HR. And the funny thing about this role, and I'll talk about in a few minutes, is that the more I ran away from it after I was done with HR, the more I always find myself back in very typical HR type universes and doing consulting around HR and that sort of thing. So it's very interesting, where if I was to look back at my history at the company, the worst role I ever had was the one role that's really shaped a lot of what I do now that I run my own business. Anyway, so we did that and it was great. And then thereafter, around 2013, the company, we'd put together a case around real investment across the African continent, and our CEO actually listened. And so what he did was he gave us a fund for Africa. It was $75 million, and he gave us 3 years. We called it Microsoft for Africa. And he said to us, listen, the world is moving and we're moving to the cloud. And while we're moving to the cloud, Africa's internet penetration rates are something like 16%. You're going to work yourselves out of a job because you're doing a whole lot of selling on the front end and not enough business or market development on the back end to create your customer for tomorrow. So here's some money. You guys figure out how to get more people connected to the internet, how to get more people using Microsoft, or how to get more startups successful, let me put it that way. And most importantly, figure out a way to skill the continent on the Microsoft platform and Microsoft technologies. So we took that money and built a team of 12 people where I was happy to be the CMO, so I was head of marketing there. And I spent 5 years there, and we really got to do phenomenal things. We spent a lot of time skilling young developers across the continent. And I have to say, I'm so happy to see a lot of even Microsoft's competitors at the time came in and started doing pretty much the same thing. I think that this is a space on the continent where more is definitely better. I think secondly, I would say that across the continent, we invested in some interesting last mile internet connectivity, things like TV white space. It was a very, very interesting time to be in that space. But more importantly, we built a little fund, and we were early investors in a lot of the successful startups on the continent today. And I think that whenever I look back at my career at Microsoft, I think that if it had ended before I did Microsoft for Africa, I think I would be extremely unfulfilled on my own. Anyway, so it was great. And then it was 20 years. And I just thought to myself, I've got to get out and do something else. And while, I give my notice 18 months before, and while I'm waiting to do, to figure out, where I've been working with a lot of startups, and I think to myself, I've been exposed, I've got good connections, and I'm going to come up with this amazing idea that's going to be the idea for my startup, because I knew I didn't want to work for anybody. I was done with that. And then it's just going to be fantastic. And then, and remember, I've given my notice 18 months before. And in that 18-month build-up period, it ends. And actually, I have no great idea. And in fact, I have a newfound huge amount of respect for startup founders. It's like, every article you've ever read says, do you solve your own problem first? And I'm like, I don't know, like which problem do I solve, and how do you solve it in a way that is that can scale and that is impactful, and is my problem a big problem, So while I was twiddling my thumbs, I got the opportunity to join an organization called GE. So they come to me and they say to me, listen, we've got a position, GE Healthcare, CMO. I think to myself, okay, I like healthcare. I really buy into, and at the time, my sister's quite unwell, so she was struggling with cancer at the time. And I think to myself, there's this whole concept around universal healthcare across Africa. And GE seemed to be investing quite a bit in that. So why don't I go learn a little bit about healthcare? And maybe this is where I'll get some inspiration from. So I joined GE, and the month I joined them, GE is actually turning 127 years old as a company, right? And suddenly I was like, I've come from tech, and Microsoft is not a young tech company. They just turned 47, I think it was last week. But when you compare 47 and then you compare a company that was built at the turn of the last century by Thomas Edison, the guy who invented the light bulb, hence GE, and it's 127 years old and has gone through so many acquisitions. I have to tell you, it was like, it was the hardest transition. And remember, I'm the person who's a lawyer, who's done marketing, finance, HR, and I pride myself on being a generalist. But 3 months in, I was clear that, I mean, they're a great company and they've gone through some changes now, but really, this was not where I was going to find what I was looking for. So I stayed for a year because I didn't want to look like, I gave up too early. And, I'm a Gen Xer. I know a lot of you are millennials and Gen Zs, but Gen Xers really care about what people think. And so I thought to myself, I'll do the year, I'll give it my best shot. And if it doesn't work for me at the end of the year, then I'm going to leave. So obviously it didn't work for me by the end of the year. And I ended up leaving GE on the day I joined a year later. And then I joined my business partner, Ivan, on this journey of building Tellistic. So at Tellistic today, we do a bunch of things. We are a software development house, and we develop a lot of applications for a broad range of customers. Our true spirit is in data. So we're a data-first company. And we do a lot of analytics and AI type solutions for customers. But most importantly, and I think this is where our heart lies, is we're a capacity building organization. And so we're seriously invested in skilling people across the African continent, starting obviously with founders. And then, of course, those founders are always looking for, so founders, in my view, are always looking for 2 or 3 things. They're going to be looking for talent, And so we do quite a bit of work around skilling talent for the startup ecosystem. They're going to be looking for capital. And unfortunately, I do not yet have a venture fund in place, but who knows, maybe that's what's going to come around the corner next. And I think beyond that, founders are going to look for network. Connect people in my networks, and I want to encourage, and not that I'm super networked, but I do know a few people in the industry. I've worked across the continent, and if there's anybody I can give you an introduction to, please feel free to hit me up, and I'm happy to help whenever I can. So with that super long, and I'm sorry if I bored you with my introduction a little bit there, but I just wanted to contextualize some of my experiences, and I think you'll see those coming through throughout our conversation. But it's really a pleasure to be here today. And thank you so much for those who are writing and saying that it's a great story. So thank you very much for that. So a couple of things we're going to touch on today. We've done welcome introductions, and I welcome all of you that are on the call as well. And then we'll touch on a couple of topics. I want to talk about key levers for growth, and particularly as they relate to people and the function of people in your organization. I want to talk about hiring. I'm a startup founder myself, and I have to tell you, this is one of the hardest things I have to do. And please remember, I came from HR where I'm supposed to know these things, but I don't quite know them yet, right? And I still stumble and fall. So we'll talk a little bit about hiring, but not just hiring. And we're not talking about interview processes, but that piece there that says for growth is really one of the more important pieces of the conversation. And then we'll talk a little bit about your organizational structure and organizational development, and then we'll open for feedback, questions and comments. In the meantime, if you have a super burning question, feel free to type it into the window or put up your hand, and I'll call upon you, and then we can have a good discussion. Okay, so talking about key levers, and I didn't confess to this before, and I see a couple of members of my team. This is one of my favorite quotes in my life currently. And this is a bit of a science quiz. So if you know the answer, I want you to type it into the window without searching, okay? So who said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the earth? This is how we'll know whether you were paying attention in school or not. So type into the window your answer. Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the earth. And anything beyond 30 seconds means that you're Googling it. Yeah. Anybody want to go? I can see Festus is typing. Nana beat you to it. It will depend on the school you attended. Okay, that's hilarious. So this is Archimedes. This was said by Archimedes, and it's part of the Archimedes principle, and it's the principle of leverage, right? And in any startup environment that you're in, I really think that conversation around leverage is one of the conversations that you consistently have with yourself. You're only going to have a limited number of places to stand or levers long enough that will help you move the world, right? And so today, one of those levers that we're going to talk about is going to be people, right? But as I contextualize some of that, I really want to talk about, from my perspective, if you look at it holistically, and I'm inspired by a number of people. By the way, I like to share quotes and that sort of thing, so I'll share some of those with you at the end of the conversation. But one of the big conversations is always going to be about the power of leverage and what levers you have within your organization today. So conversation today is about people or labor or human capital or whatever you want to call it. And it is a major form of leverage. It is the oldest form of leverage. And to be honest, and I stand corrected, and I'd love this to be part of a discussion point, I think sometimes it is the worst form of leverage, particularly in the modern world, right? Number one, if you're going to grow your company primarily based on people only, you're going to have to do some super heavy lifting, and particularly in terms of leading a large number of people. It's so funny. I don't know how many of you have seen this whole narrative, and I don't want to bring it up because I'm not taking sides, certainly, but there's a whole flutter wave narrative going on right now. And I think that fundamentally at the end of it all, and this is not necessarily about the founder of Flutterwave, but I think at some fundamental level, it truly is about leadership. And leadership, honestly, if you're going to grow into a big organization, is not only about the founder, but is about the layers of leadership within your organization and that how that translates to results, and more importantly, how that changes to being your culture. The reason why I say it's the worst form of leverage is because, number one, the more you have, it's not scalable. It means that you're going to spend a whole lot of money if your main form of growth or your main lever for growth is going to be people. But for the people that you have, how do we ensure that you're able to get the best out of them? And how I talked earlier about employee value propositions. How do you ensure that you're giving them the best as well, right? And some of these reputational issues end up impacting your business as a whole. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about people today. The second form of leverage is money, capital, right? So it is great. I think a lot of you on this call are on the journey to either raising capital, looking for funding from somewhere, whether it's in the form of a grant, whether it's in the form of some VC money or debt or whatever it is. I mean, money is a great form of leverage, right? And every time you make a decision, you could multiply. If you had the money, you could multiply the impact of your decision with money, right? And you can see where this has worked very well in the last century. The people who made money in the last century were the bankers, financial institutions, people who had cash as a form of leverage. Unfortunately, politicians in corrupt countries who can print money any day, right? So you can see how money makes the world go round, and it's a super multiplier. It scales very, very well. And honestly, as far as capital is concerned, the one thing you need to know as you're managing money or using it as a lever is that you have got to get really, really good at managing capital. And that way you can then use it as a real multiplier for your business, right? So two levers we've talked about. We've talked about people, and that's why we're here today. So we'll deep dive into that. And then we've talked about capital. The third form of leverage, and that's why I'm smiling, is what you are all doing, right? In the world today. It's funny, I was talking to a friend in the banking sector, and she says to me the other day, she says, every company has got to be a technology company because it's gotten to the point globally right now. It doesn't matter where you are, but you can't sufficiently scale if you're not a technology company, right? So it is code. I just, it sounds cuter when you say code. So it's code. And the reason why code is the best form of leverage, and that's why you're in the right business, by the way, is because code as a lever, if you build the right products, you have little to no marginal cost of replication. You can take the technology that you build and you can deploy it across hundreds of thousands of customers, and there's no cost to replication for you. The problem with capital and people is every time you want to scale on those two only, either you're a great capital manager or you're going to have to raise a heck of a lot of funds to use that as your primary scale lever, or you're going to have to hire tons of people and hope that you've got the capital to get those people paid, right? So marginal to no cost of replication. And I want to speak about it from two perspectives. Number one, obviously, is what you're doing. You're building great products and you're able to scale across multiple hundreds and thousands of customers. But I also want you to look at it in terms of being a form of leverage, how you use code internally or how you use technology internally. There are thousands of tools and systems and processes every day. The more your company scales and matures, the more processes and systems, and therefore the more people to manage the processes and systems in your company every day. And each one of those systems and processes is a workflow that could be coded, right? So that as you scale your organization, you don't only have to multiply people or get more capital to pay more people, but you could actually leverage technology internally to ensure that you're able to scale your internal processes as well, right? So it serves two purposes. It's the tech you're building for external use, but it's also what you're doing for yourselves internally. And I just want to cite one example here. A commonly used example of this is the company Slack. So I think, if I'm not wrong, and for the hardcore techies on the call, they may correct me, when Slack first started off, I think they were a gaming platform or something like that. And it was all about being able to see your friends online at the same time, and or people you don't know but game with them, or whatever the case may be. I guess it was like an Xbox Pass or something like that. And then as part of their product, they'd actually build Slack, right? To allow them to manage these multiples of people that are supposed to be the millions of people who are supposed to be gaming online on their platform or whatever. Long story short is that the platform, the gaming platform itself, ended up being a wash and collapsed. But what was born out of that is the workflows and the systems and the communication tools that they had built internally that ended up being Slack, right? So when you look at your organization and the opportunities, just kind of keep your eyes open, because those are all potential multipliers and wealth creators for your organization. I always say, and when we compare people, capital, and code, one of the biggest things that I can never get over is Instagram had only, if I'm not wrong, 13 employees with 30 million users when they were acquired by Facebook for I forget how many billions of dollars. It's possible to run a multi-million user company with 13 employees and get acquired by Facebook for billions. And that's because they were able to strongly leverage these three elements. So they're people. Are they the smartest, the best? Like, how are we empowering these guys? How are we ensuring that the processes that they use to do their work are translated into code, so we don't have to hire people in multiples to do the same role over and over? Those repeatable processes, turn those into code, keep headcount low. And then you've got the right capital that helps you grow the organization. So whenever you're thinking of, and I know I've been a startup founder myself, one of the things that keeps you up at night at the end of the month is, number one is payroll, but number two, the other thing keeping you up at night is you need more people, but your capital is not enough to sustain the people that you need to keep in your organization, or that you want to hire, or you need more senior resources and you don't have the capital to pay the senior resources. And it's this never ending cycle, right? So I just want you to remember these three elements, and the ring to rule them all is code. Okay. So I'm gonna kind of now narrow down into the people conversation a little bit, right? And so as I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking to myself, there's always gonna be different ways of doing things, and this is not necessarily a pure scientific approach that I use, but the way I've approached our discussion today is very much based on, I want to share what my personal best practices are. Feel free to ask me questions. You don't have to agree with everything I say, but this is what I think works. This is what I've seen work. I've worked with a huge number of startups across the continent. In as much as people think their market is different, I promise you it is never that. It's never that different, right? So these are my best practices, and feel free to challenge them, and I think that we all grow together. So I talked about hiring for growth, and I see my team's flashing. I don't know if someone cannot hear me or has a question. Let me just quickly check that. Okay, all right. No, it was a comment from before. Okay, so hiring for growth. So whenever we look at companies, startups, big organizations or whatever, but now we're talking in the startup context. For me, I mean, there's different ways to slice and dice this. This could be by revenue, but because we're having a people conversation today, I'm focusing very much on the, kind of how do you define the stage a company is at based on the people that it has. So that's the lens I've decided to use today. So founding stage is when you're 0 to 5 people, you go into early stage. When you start getting into traction, you're at that 10 to 20 employee type count. And then above that, you're in the growth stage. And then beyond that 50 plus, you're really in the big scale stage. And it's usually a very quick journey from 50 plus into 200 plus, right? But typically, anybody beyond that should be thinking about scale at that point in time. But part of what I wanted to discuss today is to say, so what decisions around people, and we talked about this being about hiring for growth, what decisions about people should you make at what stage of your growth as an organization? And so that's kind of what I want to share a little bit on today. So at the founding stage, this is my view. You're really focused on building a great product, and it can take different shapes. It's probably what you call an MVP, or you're doing testing and looking for product market fit. But at this point in time, it's primarily really, hopefully you have a co-founder and you're not carrying this load on your own. But at this point in time, it's primarily the founders of the company and maybe one or two engineers, depending on what your core business is. I just want to pause here because I recall when we were doing the interviews for this cohort, a number of people said to me that that they outsource engineering. And I really, there's different ways to do this, but the one thing that I've seen in the market and that I would strongly recommend is not to outsource your engineering. You're a tech company. It's like being a bank and you outsource capital management, right? Or being in manufacturing and you outsource the manufacturing plants to other people entirely, right? So if your tech is outsourced right now, at that founding stage is when you needed to find somebody to commit. And in fact, the trends I'm seeing in the market now is people are out there, you've got a great idea, but you're actively looking for a tech co-founder if you yourself are not a techie, for example. So if your tech is outsourced, it's very late in the game for you, and you should get your tech in-house because that's your product, that's your IP, that's what you're selling, right? So I would say at this early stage is certainly where you want to look at making sure you've got a strong developer in-house, or developer co-founder, a techie co-founder, a business guy who understands the market, is a subject matter expert. But at this stage, you really want to just look for adaptable doers, right? People who know how to get things done. This is not the stage where you're looking for a hyper specialist who is a machine learning on Python, blah, blah person. By the way, I'm not a techie. You can tell by what I just said. But at this point, you really want to make sure that you're opting and you're optimizing for generalists, people who are doers, right? The next stage that you then get into is the early stage. So early stage, you're growing 5 or 10 employees, you've achieved product market fit, or at least you have 1 or 2 customers who've tested your product and they tell you they like it. You probably now need to think of starting to grow your product in the market. This is when you go live. And so at this point, you still need multitaskers. You're not yet at the stage of going deep in terms of specialists, right? But it's also the time where you have some nice early adopters, customers who are great and they've adopted your solutions early, and you can turn those people into real spokespeople for you. Because at this point, you start to imagine what your brand looks like, and it feels too early. And it's funny, I was having this conversation with my team because somewhere between founding and early stage, you're not, even though you found product market fit, you're not yet super focused in terms of really clear on what you need to deliver and what kind of company and what you're going to be known for. But at this stage, you want people who are multitaskers, can get out there, are finding you different use cases for your solution, can understand contextually what customers are looking for, can bring it back in-house and help rebuild the product or just of the market's telling you. So this stage, you want to stay in the generalist space. You want a bunch of doers who can do anything. Remember when I described myself as a generalist, I've hopped from every role to the other, and it was not by design. It just ended up being that way. You kind of want Tanyas running around, people who can do anything and are not scared to go out and learn new things and what they have to do. So that's kind of the definition of the generalist or the multitasker. But when you start getting to the traction stage, and traction here is primarily defined as having paying customers, right? You may have had that in the early stage and maybe even in the founding stage, but at this point is where you start to have a larger number of customers getting onboarded onto your product, right? And at the traction stage, this is where you want to start looking at sales. And I'm clear there because, you know, and the more mature your company gets, the more important the role of business development and sales becomes to you, right? You start to realize that just because somebody's a great talker doesn't mean that they understand sales. This is not an individual that understands how to build a pipeline and how to grow that pipeline and how to forecast the business and how to deliver the revenue on forecast, for example. When I talk about starting to invest in business development and sales, that's what I'm talking about. And even if, based on your wallet, you can't afford to have the best seller in the market or whatever it is, you certainly want to start learning a little bit yourself around how do you run a high-performing sales organization. And it's really the science of selling. This is not that charismatic thing where you're able to kind of wow people. That's not what this part is about. This part is the science of sales. It's about what does your funnel look like? How many leads are coming into your funnel? How do you generate those leads? How do you convert those leads? How do you turn them into a sale? And how do you service that customer? How do you focus? Make sure revenue comes in on time. This is the point when you want to start investing in that. Secondly, and I'm sure a number of you have been through this, you start off with thinking that you kind of get things like your pricing right. But in the period between founding into traction, use cases have changed. Even the customer that you originally thought that you were going to target has changed a little bit. Maybe you were lucky and had one big customer, and so you were you had somebody that was subsidizing the cost. But at this point in time, at traction, when you actually start to understand what your economy, where and how your economies of scale can play, is when you're able to get your unit economics right and start to optimize your pricing. This is the point in time where you actually want to start looking at using pricing as a sales tool, right? So how do you do a freemium model for your business? How do you structure pricing across a subscription model for multi-year engagements, right? So this is really where you want to start digging in a little bit and understanding you've got enough customers to question, understand what the right price point is, what the right price motion or sales motion in terms of cost does your customer want to absorb, and then how does that impact how you price your product, right? And of course, you want to get your product in front of your customers. But the one piece of advice that if you don't listen to anything else at the traction stage, that you certainly want to do is invest in a board of advisors. Now, I am not talking about board of directors and now we look like we're Vodafone or whoever we are. No, no, no. I'm talking about at this stage, you want to look at your organization a little bit. And I threw a couple of things out there. I talked about having a high performing sales team. And maybe you yourself don't understand pipeline management, forecast, understanding the seasonality of your business, building your revenue budget, and so on. At this stage, if you're able to pick the right board of advisors, you could actually fill those senior slots or senior positions in your organization literally for free. So let me make this a little bit more practical. I just gave my story. I've spent 20 years in corporate. I know, I've got friends all over the place. When I left and not even before I left while I was on Microsoft for Africa, because we're working with a lot of startups. The one thing that a lot of my friends in corporate, whether they were in banking, insurance, you name it, right? Technology or whatever, the one thing they all wanted to do was be on a startup board, right? Number one, and this sounds really selfish, it sounds cool. And everyone wants to say in those moments, I sit on a board, right? And it doesn't matter if it's the board for MTN or Safaricom, or it's the board for Tonya Incorporated. People put that stuff on their CVs and you won't believe how complimentary it is for them. So that's one. Secondly, there's subject matter experts in a lot of these spaces that you want to start going deep on. So for example, if you're looking at your organization and you're feeling that your pricing model is not quite where it needs to be, or you're leaving money on the table, or you don't know how to structure multi-year contracts, invite a finance person to be an advisor on your board and be very flex with your board of advisors, like limit terms, because your needs are not always going to be the same. So invite people to come sit on your board for a year, but be ruthlessly selfish about who you're inviting, because you want them to give you subject matter expertise. Because remember, you've got a whole bunch of generalists at this point in time. The mistake I see a lot of startups making is you want to pepper your whole board of advisors with who's. So people who sound important. They're great, but the problem with people who sound important is they have very little time to dig deep into the things that you need help with. So at this point in time, what I'd strongly advise, and by the way, it's why we structure the accelerator this way and try to give you a bunch of advisors. I would strongly suggest, if you know the 3 areas you're struggling with as a startup today, put together, this is not directors, this is advisors, invite them, have a quarterly meeting, have one-on-ones with the different advisors depending on what your needs are, but focus it on areas where you have gaps or you don't have the strength yourself in terms of your skill set, right? I strongly advise that, and I promise you that will never end up the wrong way for you. Like I said, stay flexible, because after this, maybe next year you're gearing up for a fundraise and you need a slightly different advisor on your board, right? Because the people who understand either term sheets and blah blah, because you're going to be lost in all of this, right? So you now need to go look for somebody who's in investment banking or something like that and bring them onto your board and tap into that skill set, because you can't afford to hire that person yourself, and honestly, it's not a full-time job for them anyway. So strongly recommend at this point, invest in a good board of advisors and not your friends. Go for the skills. Then the next stage that we talked about is the growth stage. And at the growth stage, remember, after this, you're going to be in scale. So this is when you really need to understand how to manage your money and understand what your burn rate is as an organization. And this doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with raising funds. Of course, it really helps if you already imagine that you're gearing yourself up for a fundraise. At that point in time, you really want to understand certain things about your business. You want to seal the holes and the gaps, and you really want to make sure that you're well optimized, but you truly understand there's planning happening, there's monitoring happening, money's being managed right. You know what your burn rate is. Therefore, you need to know how much runway are you buying for yourself? How much do you raise? Do you go for debt? Do you go for whatever? At this point in time, the head of finance is a great friend of yours. The other thing a good, strong finance person will do, remember at traction stage, you probably had an advisory person who was super at finance, but this is not on a day-to-day basis. And when I say head of finance, I'm not talking about a bookkeeper. That was probably, you had the bookkeeper at the traction stage. Here you're thinking about the person who's really your partner as the founder in terms of understanding what kind of investments are you looking for in terms of structuring your organization well enough, starting to validate that pricing model that you put in place and understanding how that applies in terms of what you're positioning yourselves for. So I would say at this space, certainly. Number 2, in that growth stage, you want to start looking for specialists, because now it's time to grow up, right? The cute startup space where things, break things and all of that, that's done. You're in the growth stage now where you have, tens of hundreds of customers, right? And at this stage, this is where, you're managing partnerships with huge entities. You really want to make sure that stuff that's happening and how you show up as an organization is the right way to show up. It's also the stage, remember, product market fit was at the bottom of this cycle, right? This is the stage where you're kind of, you understand your product, you understand the use cases, you've launched, you've thought about your brand a little bit. You've got a good board of advisors who are telling you which way to go. You've figured out your pricing. You've got a strong, high-performing sales organization. This is the point now when you want to start building or going deeper on certain functions that you start to spot and say that if I double down on that, this potentially has the impact to multiply our revenue or multiply our pace and our velocity as an organization. So this is certainly the space that you want to invest in specialists. And then this is also the space where you can start to expand use cases. So I'll give you an example. The one thing that always strikes me in the insurtech space is the huge amount of data that is churned out by this industry. At this juncture, when you're in the growth stage, you can now start to think about, with all this data, how do we want to play this, right? Is there a use case that is a data enriched use case that we're not thinking of before? This is really the space, and because you've got a good number of customers and you've got a good number of employees, this is really the stage that you want to start testing out some of those additional product lines or new use cases for your product or whatever the case may be. Which finally brings me to the scale stage, right? And the scale stage at this point in time, for some reason, and I'm just speaking as an HR person who feels much maligned by the land of business or the universe of business, This is where you want a head of people, right? This is where you're looking at the talent across your organization. You want to grow those people. This is where it's important to retain great people. Some of these people joined you quite early on. You invested in them. Retention is your job, right? And it's not an assumption that you pay them a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. The truth is, the act of retention is strongly based on how you treat your employees, how valued they are, and do they see growth opportunities within the organization. It's influenced by culture, right? I saw on Twitter the other day, it was trending again in Nigeria about bad bosses, hashtag bad bosses or something like that, or my boss sucks or something like that. This is where the culture piece happens. This is where hiring a new person is almost impossible if you have a horrible organization that you're trying to attract people to. This is also the space where you want to start investing in proper ops processes, because you're going to scale your organization, which by default means that you're going to stretch your systems, your platforms, your resources, your people, your customer success teams, or whatever it is. And you really want to make sure that you've got a strong handle on operations within your organization. Otherwise, things will really break, right? It's also the time that then you can start thinking about a board of directors. And the board of directors, to distinguish, remember what I said about the advisors. For me, the directors are really for governance and stability, right? This is, I mean, it doesn't feel like it, but the truth is your own future and the future of your company are not necessarily the same, right? You are not your company, or your company is not you. And so, especially if you're gearing up for hyperscale, customer trust, fundraising, and that sort of thing, you really want to ensure that you've got the right level of governance happening for the organization, and that there's the right thinking around sustainability for the organization, and that it can last beyond you. The interests of the company at this stage come first, right? And that's why you want to invest in a board of directors. And then, of course, we talked about expanded use cases. So this is the place where potentially you can start thinking about data plays and how you want to grow your company, and additional use cases and complex problem solving and that sort of thing. But in my experience and having seen how people grow and scale and what measured growth, particularly in terms of people, looks like, I would say that this is what my best practice would tell me. You kind of want to look at it based on where you are as an organization. How many customers do you have? What's your rate of growth? Where would you plug yourself on this pyramid? And then what do you need to start thinking about, not only for today, but what does your next stage start to look like? And where do you get the resources to get there? So that's what it looks like in terms of hiring for growth. But just to kind of talk a little bit further then, because these things are all well and good, right? It says, oh yes, please, at growth stage now hire a CFO, but obviously things don't come out of the blue, right? So you're either going to buy, build, or borrow talent, right? And let's talk with buying. So buying is what most of us do today. It's where you recruit talent from the external labor market. There's pros and cons to this. Obviously, number one, especially if you're investing in the right tech resources, and honestly, even sales these days and product managers and you name it, resources are scarce and it's highly competitive. And, I talked about employee value propositions, but the truth is, great people are in demand. And you're going to be competing. There's been this whole long conversation happening in Nairobi, which is where I happen to, what the city I happen to call home. So my former employer, Microsoft, built an African Development Center, which, by the way, we put cases together to say, let's develop some of the Microsoft technology in the African continent. It's inclusion. It also helps build a skills base, da da da. And you know what? The new CEO comes on board and says, I love it. Let's build it. So they built 2 Africa Development Centers, one in Lagos and one in Nairobi. Biggest problem in the market today, everybody is complaining about the fact that Microsoft is taking all the talent, right? And I understand, but the truth is great talent is hard to find and the resources are scarce. So your plan to build is not necessarily, the best, your plan to buy is not necessarily always going to work out. And it also means because you're a startup, you don't necessarily always get the best, right? But the truth is, it gives you faster time to market. You're growing your company, you need to move faster. You don't have time to build or borrow people. You go out, you hire a person and you get them to do the job. So there are pros and cons here. And it works, right? So that's the buy narrative. The second is the build, which is where you look at your existing talent within your business and you decide you're going to take a bet on them and you're going to grow them as you grow your organization, right? It is fantastic for culture internally. People see career growth opportunities and people development opportunities are happening. It's very rewarding in terms of loyalty and in terms of culture. But the downside of it is that it's time consuming, right? So you don't have a person, you've got a great team there, you've got a great bench, you say, I'm going to build talent internally. It's going to take you time to build this person with 3 years sales experience into being a super seller, right? So you just know that, yes, I can build, but just know that this is time and investment. And if you've got the time to do that, and if you have the benefit of foresight and forward thinking, you want to start thinking of what your build strategy is right now. The third is you borrow resources. And borrowing resources typically happens in the form of, and I'm sure all of you have used this before, consultants, contractors, those kinds of people. It's short term. It's almost like a borrow those I can't afford kind of narrative. And actually, it works very well. The only piece I'll add on to the borrow piece is the advisors. So in the previous slide, I talked about the role of a great board of advisors. Go there first for things that you want to borrow, right? So like I said, you can't afford the resources. You don't have enough time for time to market. You want to make sure that your board is able to plug in some of those gaps for you. It's a borrow mechanism. It's not going to be long term, but it helps you bridge that gap and gets you to where you want to get to. And, I always say the truth of the matter is that ultimately everyone ends up on buy who I need and borrow who I can't afford, which is fine. My personal experience has always been that you're going to use a mix of the three, right? So you will borrow some, you will buy some, and you will build some. In the long term, build is the most rewarding because people then are very loyal to you and you have a strong company culture and people want to join the organization. But like I said, it takes time. So in the meantime, before your people are ready for the next level or the next job or whatever the case may be, find your way to either buy, which will cost you money, or to borrow the resources, right? So, I'd kind of shared the previous slide that spoke a lot to what types of roles do you want to look at as you grow your organization. But how to get there is a medley of these three factors: when to buy, when to borrow, and when to build. Okay. So, having said that, and I've touched on it twice or three times before around culture and traditions and skills, motivations and values for your team. And that always comes from the leader of the organization. I debated and I said to myself, don't want to say anything about this. And then I think in hindsight, I'm like, not enough people pay attention to the impact of these little items on the screen on the either success or failure of your entire organization. I talked about it earlier in the buy, borrow, build. Why do you want to invest some effort in building? Because that's what's going to create a culture for you. And that's what builds loyalty. And that's the difference between an organization where people are all in and an organization where people are really just lazy, right? It's how invested do they feel in the organization. So I would say you can't be everything to everybody. You need to be clear about what your values are as the founder. And on your values, you want to try and be bold and opinionated about them because you define the culture of your company. Now, obviously, I'm assuming that you've got great values. And so, of course, please go ahead and be bold and opinionated. But and that's a given. But there should be no second guessing within your team on items, for example, like how do you feel about customer satisfaction? That's a value thing. And if people are not clear on what you think about that, you will get a bad result out of the engagements that your people have with your customers. How do you feel about the quality of work? And I'm not talking as a collective, I'm talking about as an individual. And part of you being bold and opinionated about it means that you're role modeling that element, right? I would really say that it's stuff that you need to do every day. It's not stuff that's written in a book, but you need to be vocal and clear about the things that define you and are therefore part of the persona of your organization. I talked about not being everything to everybody. Sometimes there's not a right way and a wrong way to do things. I think that this speaks a lot to authenticity, honestly, of a leader. So we talked about your values and being bold and opinionated about them. I think that it's important for you to stay true to who you are as a person. So it's not to recite things that you've seen everywhere else, or maybe Mark Zuckerberg is like, that's just, if it's inauthentic to you, it doesn't get you anywhere and it ends up building the wrong culture because it's difficult for you to stay aligned with the things that you said were important to you. So I would really say, there's no right way, there's no wrong way, there are no right values or wrong values. You need to just follow the philosophy that is authentic to you and then be bold and opinionated about that. The last thing, and I kind of threw it on there because I feel very passionately about this. During hiring, the things that you care about, the values that you're bold and opinionated about, the things that are authentic to you, these are not things that you need to try and convince people about. When you're getting new people on your team, either they're aligned or they're not aligned. And I promise you, even if they sound like the best person under the sun, when they come on board, if there was no alignment and you had to convince them as to what your motivations, your values are, I promise you it will never work out. I'm sure a number of you have been through that before, and I guarantee you it happens all the time. And in hindsight, you'll come back and you'll be like, yeah, there was no alignment on values, and I know why this hasn't worked out. So I wanted to kind of touch on these, and I've got a second slide, and honestly, my second slide has been, and if there's anyone from my team here, it's really been, I read this fantastic book by this gentleman called Frank Slootman. He's the CEO of ServiceNow. He's written an amazing book about, how to create like, amazing companies in terms of, fast moving, staying on point, delivering service, growth, that sort of thing. And I think, if I pick what my motto has been for this year, and I really wanted to share it with you on a very personal level, these are the three things that for me, oh, actually, I'm not moving slides, sorry. Okay, these are the three things for me that have been super important for me over the last year. And I just wanted to share them with you because I think, and I'll share the author of the book. I'd like you to take a look at it, but I think that they're important, particularly at the stage that you all are at now with your organization. Number one is velocity, speed. The one thing that defines a startup, or the standard, the classic definition of a startup, is speed. If you're not moving fast, you're not a startup. You're the same as what we call in Kenya mama mbogas, the mamas who sell vegetables on the side of the road. The first classic definition of a startup is speed and urgency, right? So you start a business that is founded in technology, that is moving fast. I'm not saying break things, but is moving fast. And I think what I find most of the time, and I'm a big supporter of the startup industry, is that velocity is lost. You start off well. I mean, this is where you have the edge on the traditional insurers. People start off really well and for some reason seem to lose velocity somewhere. I just would like to say, as much as possible for you and your organizations, that sense of urgency, compress cycle times on things. How long does it take you to get back to a customer? How long does it take you to give them a quote? How long does it take you to fix a bug? How long does it take you? Like all of that, if you took a step back on this Easter weekend and started looking at how much slack there is in your system, because it's the nature of human beings. After a while, things just start to slow down and it becomes the way we do things. So I really want to challenge you on velocity and looking at velocity within the context of your people, the processes that are happening in your organization and how things get done. The second piece I want to talk to is standards. So there's moving fast, and that's why I said and not break things, but moving fast and raising quality at the same time. because the world these days and your customers have a very short attention span. So you can move fast, which is great. So you're getting back to them quickly. They get a quote in 10 minutes or 5 seconds or whatever it is that you've promised them. But then you're inconsistently raising the bar on standards of delivery. This is defined by being the commitment to your customer. So if you say, this is how you do things, you're going to process claims in 2 days. Are you living up to that standard? What does it take to make that a day and a half or make it a day? Right? How do you consistently think of speed, but at the same time, think of raising quality? Because it's a competitive world out there. And I think when I was talking about authenticity and the role modeling that you do as the founder of the company, it speaks to the last piece around how you hold yourself to a higher standard. This is a question I ask my team all the time. Ask yourself in the middle of the night when you're alone and you can't bullshit anybody, ask yourself, what did I do this week that moved the dial? How instrumental or essential am I to this organization? Am I just a passenger here for the ride, or am I actually driving outcomes for this organization? And in as much as you ask your team to ask themselves that, you want to ask yourself that as well, because you want to consistently keep holding yourself to a higher and higher standard, right? Which brings me to the last piece. I talked about it when I talked about the pyramid. And I don't know how many of you find yourselves here where sometimes, you started off with having, this is what we do. And then, you're building a business here and you don't just say no to customers, and also cash flow is tight and you owe rent or whatever the case may be. And so you started bolting on additional pieces like, yes, we can do that too. And yeah, we can do that as well, right? And actually we can do all these things. And it's funny, when I first started my business, a friend of mine told me, stay focused, like narrow your focus. And at that time, it was one of the top things on my mind. I was like, yep, narrow focus. We know what we're doing. We're going to be, instead of being a mile wide and an inch deep, we're going to be a mile deep and only an inch wide. And then a year or two into the business, when you stop and take a look at the number of things you've done and the number of things you've landed for customers and offerings and products and quotations and bids that you've even found yourself bidding in strange RFPs, and you're like, but I'm a startup. We don't do these kinds of things, right? You can only know this piece in hindsight. Very few, very disciplined people start off with a narrow focus and continue their journey in a narrow focus. And narrow focus doesn't necessarily only mean few things, but it's the clarity on the few things you're going to do. And that starts to define how well you do them. But more importantly, it starts to eliminate your competitors. Because when your focus is narrow, you're able to be so clear and so good at it. You're deepening your specialization there, that anybody else who comes along can't compete with you on that. But like I said, on this one, you're probably going to start off narrow, then you'll go wide and find yourself doing everything. And then you'll find yourself getting to the point where you're like, okay, we need to focus on what we're good at and then double down on that, get great at it, and ensure that nobody can beat us in this space. Right. And that then starts to speak to your culture. So I shared the previous culture slide, which was a lot about authenticity, being your true self, your values as a founder. This piece for me is the stuff that matters every day. This slide, this is the everyday. Are you moving fast enough? Why did it take 3 days? Why can't it take 1? It's about when you send out an email to a member of your team and they say, let me get back to you on Friday. Why not tomorrow? And I find sometimes when you ask the question, they'll move it to tomorrow, right? But the initial thought process was it's going to be Friday. If there's a couple of things I've learned over the last few years, and actually, to be honest, even in corporate, is around these things: velocity, standards, and narrow your focus. Get good at it. Get good at what you're good at and build from there. Okay, so I'm almost done with my speech here. I want to say a couple of lessons I like to share. I talked about board advisors and all of that. I think that leads on to what my first lessons are here. Number one, we start off, and I think we've all done it, you start off hiring junior people. I think that's okay, but I think it's a short-term goal. Junior people are and I mean junior in terms of experience. I'm not talking about an age factor here. I'm talking about experience. So they'll have a lot of enthusiasm, but they lack senior leadership, right? The problem with those junior hires is without leadership, it means you are the one micromanaging everyone across the organization. And so you find yourself becoming the chief of everything as opposed to trying to be this, like trying to run the business and be the CEO, right? How do you find the right balance that allows you to hire for the groups that are slightly larger, bit of a senior person, apply almost like an apprenticeship model where the junior people who cost a fraction of the senior person starts to learn from this person. This is how you get to the journey of building, right? I think, typically sometimes I go to startups, you've got 3 junior developers, that's great. And you say, a CTO will be the cost of 3 junior developers. That's fun, okay, maybe that's why you went for 3. But the truth is the CTO and the role and leadership they bring in is going to be completely different from the madness you're going to deal with your 3 junior developers. So I would say my first tip is to say you want to hire senior leaders and you want to hire them earlier. And the last piece I'll add on this is VCs love it. If you're going to raise money, and then you go rock up there with some low experienced people, it's not going to go well for you, right? So I really want to recommend be clear on the strategic roles you want to hire for and hire at a more senior level earlier than you think you should, right? And that's not to say that you're hiring 20 VPs. I'm just saying pick the roles that are going to have the right impact on your organization and hire them earlier. Secondly, generalist versus specialist. I've talked about that till kingdom come. I think, you kind of want to say when it's not either or, but you really want to be able to say, what's the mix and the timing of generalists versus specialists to get the right level of agility and get to the objectives of your organization and what you're trying to get to. So this is about thinking of what the mix looks like. It's not an either or, but you really want to make sure that you're at the right time, ensuring that you're kind of leaning into the specialist zone vis-a-vis the generalist zone and so on, right? The third, I talked about advisory boards. I could not advise it more. You want to be selective about who's on your advisory board. You want to head up your networks. You want to take a look internally and know where you're lacking skills. And then you want to pull in those people onto your advisory board and benefit from literally, no one gets paid to sit on an advisory board, right? So you're going to benefit free skills, that can really kind of multiply you and multiply the organization. So I'd really be saying be ruthlessly selfish about selecting a great advisory board. Think about the people that have spoken to you guys during this InnoLab Accelerator. Is there 1 or 2 people there that you kind of want to jump on quickly or early enough? Maybe it's going to be the guys from, what are the research people called? I missed their name. Anyway, those people. And you're going to say, okay, fine, I want to pick that person because we really don't have market research. But if I pick that guy from Busara, he has got the detail that I'm looking for, right? So you really want to be ruthlessly selfish about your advisory board. And then the last piece obviously was on the authenticity piece. You want to be authentic for cultural purposes. You want to build the right culture. You want to be bold about your vision, where you're going, what's important, and you want to stay true to what you're trying to build as part of the organization. Okay. Last piece I want to talk about, and then we can go into Q&A, is around your org structure, right? So, I don't know if you're familiar with Conway's law. Somebody said they were a student, and it's often used in the tech community, right? Where how do you look at your building technology and how does your organizational structure map into that? When I was at Microsoft, we always had a saying. Microsoft always says, ship the org chart, meaning that your product is aligned to your organizational chart. So for example, if Microsoft ships Windows, there is a Windows team. And on that Windows team, there's the person who does this, that, whatever you name it. But if you look at the organizational structure of Microsoft, it is mapped to the product, right? So whatever they ship is what defines, or I don't know what came first, to be honest. I joined them 20 years in or whatever, but the org chart maps the product. So I'm going to rephrase that a little bit and say, if you look at your team today, and I know they're not big teams, they're probably 3, 4, 5 people, whatever it may be. Does your org chart map what your value proposition is to your customer? So, for example, I would look at my org chart and you have a group of developers, and maybe you have 4 of them. Are those developers, one is for health, one is for blah, blah, whatever your product line is. You may not have the flexibility to build big teams like this, but you want to put leaders within or point people within your organization that speak to you shipping the org chart. One of the biggest levers for growth that Microsoft used to use so well when I was there was the reorgs. I mean, everyone will sit and say, oh, Microsoft is always going through a reorg. The truth is, when you sit in HR, you understand how a reorg is a powerful tool for prioritization. So what will happen is the year will end. It will be like, we have a reorganization happening. People are moving here, here, here. That team doesn't exist anymore. That team is now the new one. And we move forward. And that's the outcome of a process of rigorous prioritization, right? When did you last look at your organization and look at it from the context of what are we giving customers? So it's one thing to be in sales. Like, I mean, when I started looking at my organization, I started to realize that I say, we do capacity building, but I don't have anybody who wears a hat that says, I'm the head of capacity building at Holistic. I'm not shipping the org chart. You know what the problem is with that? Nobody internally, including my dev teams, focus on capacity building because nobody's really wearing that hat, right? I want you to really think about what you're putting in front of customers and how is that reflected inside of your organizations, and not look at your organization structure and what you sell customers as 2 different things. Otherwise, there will never be a congruence and the right motions around your organization. So one of the big benefits around this piece, and the reason why for me, shipping the org chart is a big deal, is number one, smaller teams work better. They work more effectively, they produce better results. So even when you're a small company, create micro teams. And people are scared of that because you're almost like you're a startup and you want everybody to know everything and everyone is involved and we're all in this business together. The truth is, history will tell you over and over again, smaller teams work more effectively and produce better results. So you want to go back and look at your organization. If you've got 5 people, 6 people, whatever you want to call it, are they mapped to, for example, if you've got a dev guy on the back end who builds and you've got a sales guy on the front end who sells, are they part of a small team together, or are dev guys on their own and salespeople on their own? That's the difference between leveraging your org chart and thinking about your organizational structure in a way that supports the business. Number 2, engage in conflict, debate, discussion. I think you can tell from the way I'm talking. I really, I'm this person who just can really get super immersed in like debate, discussion, and that sort of thing. I think it's great. I think the best ideas come out of discourse, right? And sometimes communication is, like we went through a cycle in our company recently where I talked, I'm big on asynchronous stuff, right? Like I want people to think through things and write it down. It creates great institutional history. It allows for you to have documented systems and processes and journeys to a decision in place. It doesn't sound important now. Trust me, in a year's time, when you're like, why did we give that customer that price and the salesperson has left, it will mean something else completely, right? However, that means also that you want to increase the different communication channels. So I'm not talking about like endless meetings and endless Slack chats and whatever it is, but how do you create the right mix that allows for conflict, debate, and discussion to happen respectfully, because that's where the best ideas and the best outcome from your customer will come from. Number 3, encouraging sharing of knowledge and expertise. One of the best pieces I always see, even today with my team. Remember when I talked about the developer guy and the salesperson on the front end, and yet people sometimes look at it as a sales team is one team and the dev team is another team. One of the best pieces of making this developer guy and the salesperson a team is because the knowledge and experience transfer that happens there is so phenomenal, right? People within that space will start to learn from each other. A salesperson who doesn't understand tech will suddenly be talking to you about tech because his teammate has the time and energy, because you're kind of invested in each other and you know where you're headed and you know what you're trying to build together. So that piece around sharing of knowledge and expertise and so on, spend some time and think about, how does this grow and how do we accelerate this within our organization, and how do we help unblock things, because there's such knowledge and experience sharing happening across your organization. And the last piece that I want to leave you with is what obviously we call social capital, which I think is probably a great end to anyway what I was sharing, right? Trust, helpfulness, people who understand, I got it wrong, I'm going to practice, iterate, get it right. Courage to speak up, right? I'm not, because I have a point and I know I'll be heard. Those are renewables that you cannot buy, and they power your life at work every day. And that's what's defined as social capital, which for me, when we talk about people, you start off with human capital, but the fuel that powers one human to the next in the workplace is this piece around social capital. And if you can start to think very strategically around how are we consistently building that? It's how do we build trust in the system? We talked about designing for trust. How do we encourage conflict, debate, discussion respectfully, but end up with the right outcome for the customer or the right outcome for the company? How do we share knowledge and expertise? All of that for me equals social capital, which, to be fair and honest, is probably the biggest distinguishing factor between a great company and an okay company. Okay, so that's it from me. I've done a lot of talking. I'm going to take a break there, and I'm going to take feedback, comments, agreements, disagreements. Would love to hear from you. Okay, so there's a couple of questions actually on the window. I hadn't noticed that, right? So here we go. How do you deal with, hold on. How do you deal with employees who had an attitude, and how do you motivate those doing well? It's really an interesting question. So today I'm talking to you. I'm actually at a friend's house, and she's just recently transitioned into being a CEO, or running her company. So the original founder just decided he'd had enough and handed it over to the senior employees. And she has this employee, and I'm just listening on the sidelines to the conversation, with the worst attitude ever. You know, the one of so-and-so told me this, so this is a gossip monger. Number two, if you ask a direct question, there's no direct answer. And this is a salesperson, by the way, that's the first indicator that there's no deal here anyway. And all of that is happening around me. And she finishes the call. So she finishes the call, and I'd heard her last week, and I said to her, if you, people commonly say that if in your environment, if people like that with bad attitudes go unchecked and honestly unfired, you're creating the culture or the feeling that that's the right attitude to have. This is how people are here, right? We have bad attitudes, and this is just how people work at company X. I would really like to say, and I'm a big believer in I fire fast. I am a fast firer. I can fire after 3 months. And the only reason I do that is because the truth is, you always know. Come on, you guys. You're running your business. You know when it's not going to work. The person has a bad attitude, the way they treat the employees, maybe they're sucking up to you. You always know. And that kind of, this is not a let's give you a chance, a break, let's see if you can help. That kind of stuff, I'd rather deal with somebody who came on board and was incompetent with the job, and we teach them how to do the job. But the idea of somebody with a bad attitude, I'm sorry, I just fire. Those doing well, you promote. You want to create a culture of what we reward, because it's the whole thing around the things that are rewarded in your company are the things that everybody is going to do, and that sets the culture for your company. So how do you reward? And reward, by the way, can be intrinsic. I'm not necessarily talking even about money. It means something to people, to be called out, for an email to be shared, for kudos to be sent that says so-and-so is so helpful. They do such a great job. And then, of course, you want to make sure it translates into their bonus at the end of the year or their increment. So that's what you want to do with great people. People with a bad attitude, get rid of them. That's my take. Okay. So I'm gonna take, I can see Festus's hand is up. I don't know if you're gonna ask the same question in the window. I'm gonna allow you to go and then I'll come back to your questions, your second question, Florence. I don't know if you guys can hear me. I'm asking Festus to unmute yourself and go. Okay. Let me take the next question. Have I ever had to fire someone? Of course. And how did you do it? Okay, Festus, you're there. You want to ask your question now, and then I'll come back to the question in the chat.
Actually, thank you. Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I can hear your baby, I think. But
Hello,
go ahead.
Sonia, can you hear? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
With my internet listening.
Sure, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I think two things. The first one is your I would say your encouragement or more or less, and that more I might get back here and there too.
I think I've lost you, Festus. I can't hear you anymore. I'm gonna, and it's because you're muted, maybe that's why. Do you want to just type it in? Okay, I hope he can hear me, and he types it in. Okay, so my second question is, have I ever had to fire someone? The answer is yes, many people, and for many different reasons. And how do you do it without creating any bad feelings? Honestly, this is a tricky one because oftentimes that reaction is not in your control, right? You can try and be gentle. In fact, I've seen managers try to fire people, and because of trying to be gentle, and you end up saying things you shouldn't. My advice would be, number one, get to the point quickly. This is like pulling off the band-aid, right? It's like if you extend it and you're trying to give long narratives around it, it never works out well. In fact, you end up getting caught up with other things with the employee, and in the meantime, you're headed towards, we're firing you and you're not saying it yet. So my first tip is do it quickly. Two, it's not within your control how they react. And to be honest with you, they have every right to react. I mean, it's a disappointing thing to have to tell somebody, and it's disappointing news to receive. And for me, honestly, I prefer it. I want to acknowledge that and know that it's difficult news and allow the individual to be able to process that. It's just what it is. But I find, to be honest, most times the reason why this conversation will not go well is because the person doing the firing is inadequately prepared. It's almost always driven by you don't have real examples to share why you're firing somebody. When you fire somebody, you should be talking about, we've decided to let you go. Your performance has not been up to the standards that we were expecting. For example, when you were blah, blah, blah with this customer, this customer, this customer, or your work is falling in 1, 2, 3 ways, right? So my thing is, you've got to really, and it sounds unemotional, and sometimes people look at HR people and wonder why we really look unemotional. But the truth is, facts really matter at this point in time, because people will walk out of there, and the reason why they have hard feelings is because they think that it was unfair and it was hard done by. So it's very much like giving feedback to any employee. You want to be able to speak to real scenarios. You want to be able to speak to real examples, make it real for the person. Honestly, keep it short, get to the point quickly, and that's done. Incidentally, one of the ones I find very difficult is redundancies, because in that case, for the employee, they haven't really done anything wrong, but it really feels like a rejection by the company. So for me, the redundancies are very different from firing somebody because you're letting you go. But what I will say, my take is, you really want to do it quickly. You want to have your set of facts and you want to communicate that. You want to back it up with real examples, and then you want to reiterate why we are letting you go. So that's my take, and that would be my recommendation. Okay, I have a question from Maria that says, what do you advise in the process of empowering and delegating? I find delegating really difficult. I'm not surprised, Maria. And I'm not surprised for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you're the founder and it's your baby, and when it's your baby, it's almost even like having a real child, I mean, I'm a mother, and then maybe we're a few mothers on this call as well, where you don't even want the maid to help you holding the baby because you do it best, or your husband, or whatever the case may be. This is your baby, and it's almost representative of your life's work and your identity. And so you really want to make sure that everything goes right, even though you don't have all the answers. Secondly, by default, and generally speaking, I don't think that I know of anybody who makes a great founder that doesn't have a bit of an ego themselves. So the truth is, there's a bit of ego there as well, which is that I can do this better and faster. And even if I delegate, I'm going to micromanage this because I know how to do it best. And I know that maybe that doesn't sound like the right judgment I'm making, but I'm really speaking from a personal perspective and having observed a number of founders before. The thing is, though, I will say, and my caveat is, it is very difficult to delegate that which you do not know. So my advice to you is this. Number one, before you delegate a set of tasks, do it yourself. Remember I talked about asynchronous? Create processes, write it down. So that the person you're delegating to is not left guessing and trying to imagine what they're supposed to be doing here, right? So you want to kind of create the best opportunity for success for that person that you're delegating to, and almost a manual that they can refer to every so often. Now, I'm not talking about big books here that you're writing, but just record in some way or another, or send a voice note or whatever it is, but create a process that allows you to capture how you want it done. And then the rest, you leave it to Jesus. You're just going to have to step back, and you're going to have to allow people to make a few mistakes, but you want to make a few mistakes with some guardrails in place, right? So have you put the rails in place so that when a mistake is made, it's not the end of the world for your organization. I think that if I was to look at some of the best qualities of a great leader, is number one, a lot of people think they're clear communicators while they're actually really bad communicators. So write it down, create a process, like write it, say, this is what I want, like find your way to record it, and find a way that that individual can keep referring to how you recorded it. So like I said, whether it's a voice note or a memo that you put together or whatever, but it's like reading a manual when you're installing, I don't know, your internet. So you have a manual that you keep referring to. How do you create a manual for your team? Secondly, create the guardrails that protect you and minimize risk, right? And what are your rails? Let's check in together at end of day. Let's check in together, blah, blah. Or, write in, send me a note by end of day. Those are guardrails that help give you a bit of comfort, even when you feel the need to overfunction around those moments. And then 3, you're going to have to trust. And you're going to have to trust that you made the right decision hiring this person. Because ultimately what it is that this is your choice of individual. It's your decision, and you have to be able to trust them to do the job. So there's a bit of trust, but create guardrails around that to make sure that you know, things are not like completely off the boat and you had no idea that things were going wrong. So what are your early warning signs? Those are your guardrails. But most importantly, a lot of what goes wrong comes from poor communication and most likely from you, I have to say. I hope I answered your question and not too badly. So, what encouraged me to stay at Microsoft for 20 years? You know, I have to tell you, sometimes I feel so embarrassed when I say that these days, especially to millennials and Gen Zs. It feels like I'm this person who even stays at a company for 20 years anymore. But I'll tell you, you know, on a personal level, when I reflect on myself, I said I was a generalist. The truth is, yes, I'm a generalist, but I like new things. And as long as I'm in an environment where I'm allowed to test out and try new things, I am at my happiest, right? Once things start moving, okay, we can hand that over to somebody else. I think what the company gave me was room to play and try new things. Remember, I started off, I came in as a lawyer, I went into marketing. So first channel, then product, then, you know, stint in finance, came back as CMO, then out into HR. I really think if you ask me, and that's over a 20-year period, I think I would say my typical lifetime in a role, at 3 years, I'm dying. I need to do something else. And I think what I found was an organization that allowed me every 3 years to refresh, renew, and so on. I'm a very curious person and I like learning a lot. I'm a heavy book reader. I read every day of my life and I like to learn new things. And so if it was for labor turnover and retention, a lot of times it's going to be a couple of reasons why people are not staying with you. Your culture sucks, okay? Bad attitude, leader, bad attitude people, and I don't want to work with assholes. Or it will be number two, I don't get to do exciting work. In fact, I often say to people, and it's funny, I wrote it to a friend the other day. I'm actually going to 2 ways, right? Whenever I'm thinking about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So the 4 qualities of a great career for me are always going to be: number 1, I enjoy it. Number 2, I'm good at it. Number 3, I make good money. And number 4, I'm around fascinating people. And then I typically, when I'm looking, I turn that around on its head and I start at the bottom. Where do I find fascinating people? In what ways can I make money with them? Which ones of those ways am I good at? And which ones do I enjoy? And those are typically for me from a career point of view, and especially, you know, when I'm looking for personal fulfillment in terms of career, I'm going to look for that. I don't think we're all very different. And so maybe the question, and maybe not everyone articulates it. Remember, I've sat, you know, I talk all the time. So maybe people articulate it differently. But I think people stay if they're working with fascinating people, if they're doing work that they really enjoy, if they're going to make good money while they're doing it. And honestly, they grow their skills to the extent that they actually get to be great at it. So if you're looking at churn in terms of employees, maybe start to look at some of those pieces. By the way, it creates for you even the right mix with employees. Have you ever worked with a boring person? I mean, you really want to work with fascinating people that intrigue you and bring energy and the right discourse. Are you a team of fascinating people? Is that your company? And can people grow there? And can they get good at what they do? And that speaks back to the delegating, able to learn new skills, right? And do they get paid well for it? I think that those pieces, if you answer them well enough, people stay. But just to add one last piece on that, people can't stay forever. And oftentimes, I think it was, if you know, Reid Hoffman is the founder of LinkedIn. And in his book, I think he's got a book called Blitzscaling. And you should read it or listen to it. I do audiobooks for some of that stuff. He talks about employment being like a tour of duty. It's almost like the Marines. And the Marines will go for a tour of duty. And apart from your first one, every additional tour of duty is 2 years, right? So you'll sign up Afghanistan, you go do your 2-year tour, you come back and you have the option to either re-enlist or you go. Your employee with you is like they're on a tour of duty. They don't owe you. They're not going to give the days of giving their lives to the companies, I think, are long gone, right? And some people might stay and some people might not. But even in some cases, for some people, I think it's not a bad thing to have a conversation around, I'm stifling your growth. You need to go somewhere else. And when you come back to us, you're going to be even more phenomenal, right? So I think it's a balance between expectations of your expectations, but secondly, that piece around fascinating people, that sort of thing. Am I good at it? Do I enjoy it? How do you bring that combo together? Yeah. Okay. So Festus, you're back. You want to ask your question before I move on? I can see Michael has just typed in a question. Go ahead, Festus.
Yes, Tonya, I'm back and thank you. So first, I do appreciate your presentation and the pieces of advice you offered to us. One of the things that really resonates with me is the issue of getting a tech person on your team as quickly as possible. And I will share my personal experience when I decided to start Fake Tech. I was a bit confused as to which direction I was supposed to go because I was not a tech person. I'm an investment banker by profession. And when I spoke to one or two people, they said, look, you need to find somebody who is a tech and can bring the person on board as a shareholder. So quickly I met with my current co-founder and we spoke about what I wanted to do. And I said, look, this is what I have on the table. If you can think through it and come back to me to say whether yes or no. Fortunately for me, he's somebody who had in the past been part of a startup, so he kind of have an idea of what it entails. And I'm happy to say he was ready to come on board, and he's done a fantastic job since he came in till this time, even though we've relied on some contractors, I would say, or consultants to do one or two things for us. But he being a core member of the team has really helped us to move our product development forward. And I do see that his continuing presence will help us achieve a lot of things. So I will also, encourage other entrepreneurs on the call that they should look at it if they don't have any tech person. It doesn't really take a lot to bring a tech person on board at the moment. You have to just agree on how much you want to give to the person and make sure it happens. Don't think of screwing the person along the line. Let the person believe in what you are doing. And I'm sure if you have such a person on the team, you're going to go very, very far because it helps. Now, if there's any conversation around tech, I don't need to scratch my head and answer a lot of questions. I tell him, hey, Neram, you have to be there to do what you are supposed to do. The other thing is, I was still wanted to, I don't know whether you answered, but I was looking at the timelines between, the growth phases of the business. Sometimes I think there could be an overlap because depending on the industry in which you play, you should be able to look at all those things in line with your strategy and your plan. And I think that is also a key thing. As you were talking, you made mention of the floater wave issue that is currently brewing in the industry, and I'm just amazed how things are going. I will encourage my fellow entrepreneurs to read the story. And I'm an investment banker, and so I do understand some of the nuances when it comes, as an entrepreneur, you try to give a false impression or image to the industry, and then you get investors on board. Trust me, the numbers never lie. After 20, 30 years, they will come back to bite you. We've known the cases of Aaron and others in the past, and I think that is something we should be all careful how we drive the agenda, especially when you are in the fundraising phase. You have to be sure that your stories stick together and be consistent and treat your employees very well. I'm looking forward to hiring my first employee, even though we have co-founders, but I'm looking forward to hiring the first employee and to see how the feeling is like and to treat them, as part and parcel of a journey. So thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed the session tonight. And I think it gives me it's a booster for me for my pitch recording tomorrow.
Thank you, Festus. Appreciate it. Mark has his hand up. You have a question, Mark? If you're speaking, you're on mute. You want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. I thought I had unmuted. So thank you, Tonya, for this session. Honestly, for me, it's been the best because I've gone through some phases of the growth level already, and I've been hit by serious, if you want, employee cuts down at some point. And so I have faced some realities of what you are talking about. And the people's leverage is for me, is the most important thing as an entrepreneur. The question I would like to ask is that how do you build resilience, and then if you want backups in terms of your core employees? I'm asking this question on the back of recent happenings in my business. Okay, so some 3 months ago, we had a very huge team which was doing well because we were building for clients and they were paying. We are still building for clients and they are paying. Yet, the very core ones you have, especially those you have trained from scratch, whom you have groomed, you have impacted to be able to do a lot of things, get to say, okay, enough, I want to go. And for the kind of projects we are doing and the kind of things they are doing specifically, it virtually puts the whole business to a halt. And so at some point you have to re-engineer the whole process. So for a business like this, how do you build resilience and backup so you don't get stuck at such points? That would be my question.
And Mark, that's a great question. If I was to say in my view, even for me personally, sometimes the biggest risk to the business has been losing such a crucial person. Sometimes can literally bring you down to your knees. And I don't know if there's a direct answer, but you're in the insurtech space. If you looked and forgive me, I'm not saying people are products, right? They're just a form of leverage, but they're not products. How would you de-risk your model, right? Where if you've got one person who, if they leave, you're finished. What does de-risking that model mean, right? And the leave and you're finished, is that a function of they have such a specialized skill set that nobody else could come and build? I'll give you an example of what we try to do in our organization. So we had kind of two problems. That's one where you kind of want to de-risk a little bit and say, I don't want to ever find myself in a situation where if this person leaves, we're going to be left hanging. But at the same time, I can't afford just to, hire other people who are going to be on payroll when I don't need like this, it feels like fat in the system, right? So that definitely doesn't work for me. And so what my partner and I had decided to do at the time was say, we were going to build our own little quote unquote internship model. And let me call it apprenticeship model. And for two reasons. Number one is, there are a lot of people in coding schools and boot camps and whatever, and that's great. But that doesn't necessarily make a great software engineer, right? A great software engineer is really a lot more about not just the coding, but the understanding of how to apply technology towards solving a problem. So we say, what would happen if we picked 3 young apprentices and brought them on board and have them, it's at a stipend, shadow a senior developer? The best way people learn is through doing. So we create an environment where people learn through doing. And so, and then secondly, what it also does is not only one person knows what's happening in the project at a time, such that if they leave you, you're kind of left not understanding what's happening because you've got your 2-3 apprentices who are part of the process. So that's kind of the way we decided to solve for that problem. And then, of course, COVID hit, and then nothing happened according to plan. But we did get one of our apprentices on board, and he's actually now a full-time employee. And coincidentally, I saw him on the call earlier. I would say, Mark, and that worked for us. It's not the silver bullet. I would say find a way to de-risk. And your biggest risk is that all that information, the IP, is in somebody's head. That's actually your bigger problem. How do you get that out of the guy's head and sitting and it's creating the wiki for your company? How do you move that there? Because your biggest risk, thank you. Your biggest risk is not, I mean, people will always leave. And you can't control that. And there's no silver bullet. And people leave the best companies in the world, right? So that part is a little bit, and they'll leave for different reasons. That part is a little bit beyond your control. Your role is to de-risk your business. You need to create a system that ensures that everything that's happening on that build for every customer is in a centralized, I don't know, I'm not a techie, DevOps platform with notes attached, blah, blah. Consider the apprenticeship model. Pay them a small stipend. They're learning. It's almost like they're paying to learn, right? It's like school fees. But you have one or two other people who are on the project, who know what's going on, who have access to everything. I think your model is around de-risking from that perspective, rather than imagining that people will not leave you, because they'll leave you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tonya. Let me share this too. I think I did a bit of the de-risking, and one of the things I did, and I would like others to learn, that's the reason why I'm sharing, is the fact that when you have a team of engineers, make sure everybody in the team knows one core programming language that cuts across. That's what we do in our business. So we have two very core programming languages. Everybody in the team must be able to program in, especially for the back end.
Yeah.
So what happens is that at any point, if anybody is not around, somebody can step in.
Yeah.
But the fact that we have divided our teams into, we have the insurance bit, we have the healthcare bit, and all that. So the difficulty was moving someone from the other team to join one team, which would mean that though the person understands the core programming language, but the business line of insurance will be difficult for the person. So I think that's where your idea of building an apprenticeship model comes in, and I think it's worth considering. It's something I would try and see how to implement and see how it goes. But ideally, what I did in terms of,
and I'm happy to share some of the thinking we put into it. So if you want to, drop me a note after, happy to share. Yeah.
right, sure, I will do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we are up on the 2-hour mark. There was one gentleman called Michael who asked a question that I didn't get to. How do we deal with perception of employees on employers? This is like, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and she's really the like the best thing. I only have one child, and she's the best thing that ever happened to me. But she's 15, and she thinks I'm the least cool person on the universe. And even when I try and get involved, it just gets worse. So now I'm almost like, I don't know whether to be involved or not involved, or whatever the case is. I think that's an employee-employer thing. If you kind of over focus on how do you change the perception of employees on the employers, I think it's more about what you do than what you say. And I would strongly encourage, and take a bit of a pulse check with your team and see what they think of you. And because everyone could do with feedback. And sometimes the problem with being a founder in a business is nobody gives you direct feedback. You don't even know when you're the problem or the bottleneck. And sometimes even culturally for us as Africans, people, this is not like you're in Silicon Valley where people just pop into your office and tell you all sorts of things. So people don't necessarily give you direct feedback. And it's very easy to live in your little bubble and imagine that there's, you're there on your throne and everybody's the one doing things wrong. create the right feedback mechanisms, take the feedback from your team. In fact, I'm long overdue for doing that with my team, so thank you for reminding me. And then work on areas where you need to grow, because we all need to grow and change as people, right? So I would really recommend that rather than caring too much about the outcome, this perception thing is a lagging indicator. I talked about those earlier. The leading indicator is, what does it feel like every day to come and work for you? And how do you as a founder get better at that? And if you fix that, the perception changes. Or else maybe you just have people who will never be satisfied, and you need to figure out, how do you start working with fascinating people again? So I'm gonna stop there, ladies and gentlemen. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. For those, I presume most of you have my email address, but in case you don't, typing it into the window. I'm available to chat if you want to hit me up for, a quick piece of advice, or, you just need the sounding board for anything. I'm very available for that as well. I want to wish you all the best. I know you're doing your pitch recordings right now, and I know it's usually just such a hairy time, and you really want to get that right. So if there's any way in which I can help, I'd be really happy to. So please feel free to reach out to me. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you this evening, and I want to wish you a great rest of the evening for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tonya. It's been an amazing session. I love it. Have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Florence. And thank you all very much. Thank you, Maria. Appreciate it.